Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Lacuna Coil, titled Broken Crown Halo. Now I've mentioned in the past that I've got something of a complicated relationship with gothic music, because despite some of the things I have mentioned, I do like a large chunk of it, and a lot of bands that pioneered the format remain real favorites of mine to this day. And hell, while I never really had an angry white boy phase as a teenager, I won't deny that my unironic love for symphonic metal had more than a passing fondness for the goth subculture. But you know what? Maybe it's just greater exposure to it, but I only tend to tolerate gothic music of certain veins in very small doses, and I liken it to that friend you idolize on some level for being a badass. Sure, he's cool and he's dark and he's edgy and can take you on a wild ride that one time, but in the end, that brand of darkness either becomes too depressing or too insufferable to really tolerate. It's one of the primary character arcs of Edgar Wright's movie The World's End with Simon Pegg's character, and there's a lot of elements that ring true there in the music scene as well. Plus, I'll reiterate what I normally say about nihilistic artwork. If you don't switch up the formula, or you don't innovate it beyond the standard goth cliches, it can get very insufferable very, very fast. And you know, the funny thing is that 4 albums into the goth metal band Lacuna Coil's career, and after the star-making double punch of Coma Lies and Karma Code, they seem to have a similar revelation. For me, growing up, Lacuna Coil was the good version of Evanescence, and while they weren't really on the same playing field as Nightwish or With Temptation, they still had a niche that I really did appreciate. But 4 albums in, after playing some pretty damn solid gothic metal, they flipped the script somewhat in 2009 with their album Shallow Life. Now, that still had many goth cliches, but a more mainstream accessible approach and focus. Unfortunately, they got this thanks to producer Don Gilmore, who is most famous for working with Linkin Park, Good Charlotte, and the Hollywood Undead. And honestly, well, I can't say Lacuna Coil delivered any of their best material on either Shallow Life or their 2012 album Dark Adrenaline. I blame Gilmore for why those albums are nowhere near as great as their predecessors, mostly by placing the guitars on the surface of the mix and then dampening the melody, and moving the vocal tracks closer to the front. And look, let's be honest here. The lyrics have never, ever been Lacuna Coil's strong point, and by lessening the focus on the melody, the songs got a lot more interchangeable and considerably weaker. The albums weren't really bad so much as bland, and thus, I was actually kind of enthused when I saw that they had ditched Gilmore as a producer for their newest album, Broken Crown Halo. And while I wasn't expecting a return to the glory days, you can't hope for that, I did hope that the band would be able to recover some of their spark. Did they pull it off? Well, it's not as bad as Shallow Life, I guess. But even though Broken Crown Halo does have a marginally more interesting concept and a little bit more narrative ambition, it's not as consistent as Dark Adrenaline, and nowhere near in the same ballpark as their truly great albums. And you know what the most frustrating part of it all is? That Lacuna Coil's Broken Crown Halo is the worst sort of album for me to review. Not a bad album from a band that I used to like, but only a decent album that has just enough of the old spark to be freshly disappointing all the same. And coming up with anything substantial to really say about this album altogether, yeah, that's become the real challenge for me. And that's also the main reason why this review is as late as it is compared to the album release. But first, let's address the biggest shift, which is the replacement of Don Gilmore with Jay Baumgartner. And finally, the guitars actually have some solid depth in the mix, and occasionally build to a pretty potent riff. But with every step Lacuna Coil takes forward, it takes another step back, as the production unearths new problems and doesn't fix all the old ones. For one, this drum production, especially on the cymbals, it's really quite shoddy, with the sound often coming across as very wispy or just submerged at the back of the mix. And while Lacuna Coil has never been a guitar-driven band in terms of melody, the synth choices they use to carry those melodies are either these glittering lines that get lost in the shuffle, or so fuzz-saturated they lose any sort of cohesion. And yeah, sure, I know since Karma Code, Lacuna Coil has never been the tightest of bands, but here the lumbering bloat in the synth lines is a stark contrast against the painfully underweight and not particularly interesting melodies, most of which don't do enough to stand out or flow well with the chugging guitars. That is, when they're not so fuzzy to lose all sense of decent tune. And really, this tuneless malaise is arguably the biggest issue instrumentally for Lacuna Coil. But, you know, I can't say they weren't trying to craft more diverse and interesting songs. There's definitely a stronger symphonic element on this record, and on songs like I Burn in You, there are some attempts to add a more diverse instrumentation, but most of it feels very strangely hollow and lacking in true dramatic swell. None of the instrumentation is allowed to really grow within the mix, most of which I'm going to blame on the electronic elements, which really feel tacked onto this record in an attempt to modernize the sound, something that this album has never needed. This has been a consistent problem with Lacuna Coil for a couple of years now. I don't understand why they keep adding these electronic elements that never really fit with the rest of the songs. And honestly, that's the only explanation I can find out for the auto-tune on Christina's vocals, which might fit the tone somewhat on Cybersleep, but everywhere else feels completely unnecessary. She has a beautiful voice, why auto-tune it? Now this takes us to the lyrics and themes, which do deserve some scrutiny because Broken Crown Halo is a concept album. And at first glance, it's a great idea. It's one they've tried before though, but it's good to see it come back here. Lacuna Coil has developed something of a reputation for retreading similar ground lyrically, so a new concept could only be a good idea for the band. And then they chose to make the album about a post-apocalyptic dystopia, most likely one overrun by zombies. Ugh. Now look, I'm not against this theory. You can make good music out of anything, and Lacuna Coil's brand of passive-aggressive melancholy, you know what? It's a pretty apt fit for those kinds of scenarios you would see in the typical zombie apocalypse. But in recent years, the zombie apocalypse well has been so thoroughly tapped and played out in modern culture that unless you dramatically reinvent the concept or tone, you're gonna be inevitably retreading old ground. And unfortunately, that's what happens here. And since Lacuna Coil have never really been great lyrical songwriters in terms of their subject matter or presentation, we get a lot of reiterated text, but not a lot of subtext or depth. We get songs about the emptiness of existence and parallels with modern culture. We get songs about life on the run and personality conflicts, the killing of a friend who's infected before he turns into a zombie, the loss of humanity in face of despair and overwhelming odds, the loneliness after the carnage. Look, we've all seen this all before, and frankly, done a whole lot better. But you know what? There's one song that really does stand out in a great way, and that song is Die and Rise. Not only because it has the weight and seething power of a Korn song actually done right, but it's a song framed from the zombies' point of view. And unlike most art presented from that particular point of view, like Warm Bodies, there's a visceral hunger and a sense of raw excitement that lends the song a ton of flavor and life. Well, okay, maybe not life, maybe unlife, but still! Not only is it a step in a new direction for the zombie genre, which is pretty damn close to unprecedented, it's a great song all the same and shows a new idea that the band really could have explored. The problem is, it's really the only song on this album that has that level of creativity, which is really kind of sad. Look, in the end, Broken Crown Halo is not bad, and there are moments that I like, but it's an album that confirms something that I've suspected since Dark Adrenaline, and that's the fact that Lacuna Coil, they might be running out of ideas. Definitely instrumentally, if not lyrically. And sure, putting a new spin on old concepts can work if you do make it fresh, if you do something special. But with this album, we don't really get that fresh spin, and it leaves the album really kind of tedious by the end. And believe me, I hate to say that about a band that made Comalize and Karma Code, but sometimes you need to do more. That said, the album, it's listenable, and it's arguably decent, which earns a 6 out of 10 from me and something of a recommendation. But frankly, Lacuna Coil should be better than just listenable. And while I used to think they were capable of more, now, I just don't know. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Bit of a downbeat review, but hey, I was hoping for better, and that doesn't always happen. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at this year, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.